This is Lucy Morgan. Welcome to video 3, and in this video we're going to walk you through some additional pain points and gotchas that we want you to be aware of in a little more detail than what we may have done in some of the other videos, so that you're aware of these and can avoid them. These are 5 areas that we don't want you to miss in the grant implementation, and that's why we're going to cover them in a little more depth so that you make sure that you've got these ducks in a row as well. The first area has to do with must versus should. Now, in the new grant regulations, if you haven't read all 103 pages, there are references to things that you must do and there are references to things that you should do. In fact, there are 823 musts and only 202 shoulds. Now, if it's a must, that means it's a requirement, so you need to be aware of that those are things that must be implemented. However, should means that it's a best practices or recommended approach. So when you're looking at your implementation and figuring out what's a priority, obviously the musts are going to be a higher priority than the shoulds. The second area that I wanted to highlight has to do with family-friendly policies. Now, some of you have seen in other videos where we've talked about these a little bit, but I wanted to get down into some more of the details. The first area has to do with the desire to balance family and work responsibilities. This is because they did some studies and found that many women were not opting to work in research fields for federal awards because they had other work and family responsibilities. So the underlying issue here is finding ways to support women in the science and technology fields, and really any of the STEM fields: science, technologies, engineering, and mathematics. They felt that if they had policies in place that supported family responsibilities, that more women would be involved in research fields, and it would create more opportunities for careers supporting federal awards. And in some of their survey work, they found that conferences and travel costs were some major areas that women identified as having problems with being able to travel to things like scientific conferences and other similar activities. So that was the focus for the new grant regulations. It's a public policy requirement, but it also will have some direct impact on your policies within your organization and possibly with your employee handbooks. So let's specifically look at a couple of these areas. The first one has to do with conference spending. And so the new cost principles actually does allow for the cost of determining locally available child care resources to be in your conference spending as an allowable cost. Now, it doesn't include the actual cost of child care during the conference, but there are some exceptions to that that you need to be aware of. And those are things like if you are possibly a tribal government where that has been approved by your federal funding agency, they are allowing some exceptions to actually provide child care during things like meetings and conferences. But again, it has some very narrow requirements, so you want to be aware that that's a possibility, but then also know what the requirements are, or you'll risk having costs disallowed. Area number 4 has to do with travel, and this again is part of the family-friendly policies, that they are going to allow temporary dependent care during these travel situations, but not the cost of actually traveling with the dependent. It has to be a direct result of travel to a conference for an award, and it needs to be both temporary, so not a long-term dependent care type of charge. So it has to be temporary, but also consistent with the travel policy. So this is where you want to look at what your travel policy is and see if you need to make some updates so that you can support this temporary dependent care in your award costs. The 5th area that I wanted to highlight has to do with the Federal Audit Clearinghouse. The Federal Audit Clearinghouse, as I talked about in the last video, is going to become more and more significant in being the repository for audit and other information. It's a place where they're going to centralize audit reports and also findings, and this is where some of the analytics to see if people are having findings year after year are going to reside. It's important for both recipients and subrecipients to be aware of this, because what is going to happen is subrecipients will be filing their audit reports in the Federal Audit Clearinghouse in many cases, and recipients who are doing subrecipient monitoring will actually get those audit reports out of the Audit Clearinghouse as opposed to having to get them from the subrecipient. So it should streamline some of the subrecipient monitoring, but there are some exceptions. One of the hopes is that it's going to reduce the duplication of reports so that there's not separate copies that have to go to the pass-through entity. But there are actually some exceptions in these requirements. Again, for Indian tribes, the concern that was expressed is that there's some sensitive information that they didn't want to have out on the Federal Audit Clearinghouse, and so there are some exceptions written into the new grant regulations for Indian tribes and others as well. So that wraps up our third video, and in our fourth video we're going to get into the actual impact in the various functional areas and how to start that conversation with the various departments about how the new OMB Super Circular is going to make an impact in their department as well.